Hi, everyone. Okay, so let me open up the smart attendance for the class. And here's close this, close this, close this, go close this, close here, and we go to attendance and scroll down and make sure you can see all of this. So go here and your smart attendance number is 326, 326. Okay, so again, just to remind you that this is the last set of the last week. We've scheduled a debate on Wednesday, so we will have class on Wednesday, even though it's technically the start of the final exam week, because in part because I have a debate. So Anais is my opponent in the debate, unless Kiddo is going to sign up for a debate for the last chance of the debate on Wednesday.
Yes, I will. Yes.
Hey, all right. So it'll be a debate on Wednesday. So please come to class because we've done the debates over the computer. I don't think they work very well because, well, it's up to you. But I mean, still be better if we had an in-class debate.
Sir, because I missed the first sessions, I wanted to understand. So I need to prepare 3 parts of 5 minutes, or how much in total?
It's on the debate evaluation rubric, which I posted on the assignments sheet. So you can see here 6 minutes opening statement for pro, then 6 minutes opening statement for con. And again, make sure that you can see this. So I have to share screen. So under the assignments here. So if we scroll down, and you can see the evaluation. Well, I don't have the rubric there. Okay, well, I guess the debate rubric is here. And so, yeah, 6 minutes opening statement for pro, and then 6 minutes opening statement for con, and then pro rebuts for 4 minutes, and then con rebuts concludes for 7 minutes, and then pro has the last word for about 3 minutes. And so the again, so 66473 is the time breakdown, and I'm looking for the rubric. Where is the debate rubric? I have it somewhere here that I didn't post this time for some reason, but and of course your final exam paper is due on final draft is due on Saturday, and so we have to be pretty strict about the deadlines. So here's the debate evaluation rubric here. You can see that I posted a long time ago. 66473 is the time frame, and we will be evaluating the performance of the debaters in terms of their opening statement, excellent, good, and so on, rebuttal, and so on, presentation style, and use of week's reading material. And so you can prepare a PowerPoint presentation or whatever as part of the presentation style for your audiovisual aids, whatever you want to do. And so we'll use almost all the class time for the debate on Wednesday for that. And people are going to start meeting with me in my office also. And so starting tomorrow. And so you know where to go to see that sign-up sheet. Go here again to final examination conference session. So starting tomorrow with Ella and Sarah and Kritika and Anais and Kim Pyong-koo as well for Tuesday. Okay, so yes. Okay, I know I sent it to your email address, but it might have gone to your spam folder or because it's some kind of Google Drive thing. So please send me an email to remind me, or go there yourself if you can, and just or choose a time you want, and I'll see if it's available. Okay, so that's the plan. And let me see here. So let's go on to the notes. And so I wanted to, we've been doing these exercises in class that were prepared by this organization called iCivics, which was launched with great fanfare to help American teachers do a better job in teaching American students about American political system and how to be good citizens of the United States by being responsible participants in the policy and political process of the United States. And so this is the latest edition uploaded there to the icivics.org website. And so you can see it has a nice little instruction PDF file that we can use as teachers for American high school students regarding the peaceful transfer of power. And of course, that's that responds to Donald Trump and the January 6, 2001 riot. And that this is something that we really took for granted until a year and a half ago, or less than a year and a half ago. And it's now a big focus of public television proceedings and as a result of the congressional investigation of what happened there. And so it highlights that this peaceful transfer of power is nothing less than a miracle, according to Ronald Reagan, the first inaugural address in 1981. In the eyes of many in the world, this every 4-year ceremony we accept as normal is nothing less than a miracle. And of course, it was supposedly set by George Washington, so everybody knows who George Washington is. Do I have any $1 bills here? Yes, he's on the $1 bill of the United States. There he is, George Washington, the father of our country, the military leader of the continental armies against the British Empire. And he, of course, became the first president of the U.S. under the new Constitution that was written in 1787. And the Constitution was pretty much written for the people that were the leaders of the revolution to occupy the leading role. So everybody knew he was going to be the president. And he knew he was going to be the president. And he chaired the Constitutional Convention that wrote the Constitution. And he never had any children, which is interesting, right? Because if he had children, there might have been more incentive or pressure upon him to make himself an American king, like in Great Britain. And there were some of his veterans in his military unit formed what was called the Cincinnati Society, calling upon him to institute a more authoritarian regime in the United States, and he wouldn't agree to it for whatever reasons. I don't know. People have always wondered. He and his wife never had any children, never have any offspring, and he chose, after serving 2 terms, to step down as president rather than go up for re-election for a 3rd term. And that was the custom that stayed in place, wasn't really changed until after the experience of Roosevelt. Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the 1930s ran 4 times and won 4 times to become president of the United States, and then died soon after winning election for his 4th term, to be replaced by Harry S. Truman, who was the president when the Korean War started. And Harry S. Truman served as president for about, I think Roosevelt died in April 1945. So just a couple of months after he won re-election, Roosevelt died. So Harry S. Truman was president for almost 4 years before he ran for re-election in 1948. And I saw one source that claimed that Harry S. Truman was thinking about running for president for re-election again in 1952, but the Korean War was very unpopular. And there were already what we call primary events today in the late 1940s, or in the early 1950s. There were events leading into the nomination process for the Democratic Party to choose somebody to run for president. And Truman lost. The sitting president lost those initial events in 1952 and realized or learned that he probably, if he ran for president, he was not going to get elected. He was not going to be even if he got nominated again, he would lose. Because, and according to even though the economy was doing relatively well, because of the Korean War. And that was not being settled. And of course, Dwight Eisenhower, the leader of American and British and American and French forces during World War II, ran for president in 1952 and destroyed his Democratic opposition in the form of Adlai Stevenson, and as a great American war hero who had never won or run for elected office before, Dwight Eisenhower. So Donald Trump is not the first person to be elected president of the United States without ever having been in an election previously. Even Donald Trump ran briefly for president in the year 2000 under the Reform Party that had been formed by Ross Perot in 1992, but only for a few weeks, and then he quit. He stopped running. But Dwight Eisenhower, because he's a great war hero, was chosen president. And for many people, that's not controversial. It is for me, because I don't think Dwight Eisenhower was a great president. Although the prevailing view today, particularly in 2022, with the end of the Cold War and the supposed victory of the United States in containing the Russian version of Nazi Germany, the Soviet Union, and saving you and you and you and me from communist totalitarianism, represented by Dwight Eisenhower as one of the early presidents in the early Cold War. Dwight Eisenhower didn't know much about the world at all. He knew a little bit about European politics because he'd been the SACEUR, Supreme Allied Commander Europe, during World War II. And of course, the military commander of NATO was still called the SACEUR, the SACEUR. They love acronyms, you know, in NATO and United Nations and European Union. And, but it was under Dwight Eisenhower's president that he let the Dulles brothers, Allen Dulles, the head of CIA, and his brother John Foster Dulles, control US foreign policy. And it was Allen Dulles, as director of CIA, orchestrate the coup in Iran in 1953 that overthrew the secular nationalist prime minister Mohammad Mossadegh, who nationalized the Anglo-Iranian oil company, which then became British Petroleum, BP, on behalf of the Iranian people. And the British convinced Allen Dulles and the Americans that Mohammad Mossadegh was a fool who was going to allow Iran to fall under communist Soviet domination because he refused to suppress the communist party in Iran called the Tudeh Party. And so the United States, with the British, organized Operation Ajax, which is on Wikipedia. You can look it up. My professor played a role in that, who died, you know, he died 25 years ago when he was in the CIA before he became a professor. And of course, it was because the Americans and the British MI5 and the CIA orchestrated this coup that secular nationalist, democratic liberal nationalism became discredited because it failed to deliver national self-determination for the Iranians. And they put the Shah of Iran, Mohammad Reza Shah, as leader again in Iran. And he became a totalitarian dictator, and his son is about my age, claims to be the claimant of the throne. He ruled until 1979 and then fled during the Iranian Islamic Revolution led by Ayatollah Khomeini. And my professor claimed that if it were not for that CIA MI5 orchestrated coup in Iran, that somebody like Ayatollah Khomeini, an authoritarian religious nationalist, would never have become who he became. He became the leader of Iranian nationalism because liberal secular nationalism failed to deliver the independence goods against the traditional British and now the American imperialists controlling the country behind the scenes. And he carried out the operation in Guatemala to overthrow Arbenz in 1954. Again, the belief that all these people were working for Soviet Union. And Arbenz tried to carry out a land reform in Guatemala, and the corporate interests, but particularly the American concerns that communism was at work through their spies directed from Moscow, directing these communist movements in these areas. I guess I can show it to you in case you're interested in looking them up. But this all happened under Eisenhower. And of course, this overthrow in Guatemala triggered a civil war that would kill hundreds of thousands of people that would continue until the early 1990s. And so, I mean, that's the nice thing about Wikipedia. When I was your age, we didn't really have these, gotta make sure I go to English. And so, so Operation Ajax. There it is, the 1950 Iranian coup d'etat. And then also our bands in Guatemala. So this is the president that the U.S. Helped overthrow, and through the 1950 Guatemala coup d'etat. There you see John Foster Dulles, the brother of Allen Dulles, who was the Secretary of State under him, Dwight Eisenhower. And there, Allen Dulles, of course, was the head of the CIA at this time. There was another coup attempt, Syria. I think it's Syria coup 1954 also. This isn't studied enough. My professor claims this was critical for putting the Assad family in power in Syria. The Americans were concerned that against the communists were going to take power, so they tried to overthrow the government to suppress the communists and cause such chaos that the communists almost took power, and then there was a military coup d'etat to stop the communists, and then the Assad family emerged within that military dictatorship, and they're still in power to this present day. So this again was their, but my professor said this needs to be studied. Somebody needs to do their PhD on this topic. It's not studied enough. We know about our Benz, we know about Operation Ajax, but this has not been studied enough. And of course, I don't speak Arabic. I don't speak Turkish or any Middle East language, so you can look that up if you're interested. Of course, the Bay of Pigs was the other one that John Foster Dulles carried out to try to overthrow Castro in Cuba, which Bay and Pigs invasion, which this happened after Eisenhower was president, but John F. Kennedy became president in 1960 and inherited this operation that Eisenhower and Nixon had over Vice President Nixon, Richard Nixon, he was given responsibility by Eisenhower for overseeing this operation. And of course, Nixon lost to Kennedy in the election. Kennedy didn't stop the operation, but he made sure it failed because they wouldn't provide air cover. He wouldn't let the U.S. Air Force bomb Cuba in support of the invasion by these people who had fled Cuba after Castro came to power. So this all happened under Eisenhower. So I'm not so convinced that Eisenhower was a great president. But now the Cold War is over. You know, anybody who was a president who appeared to be strong and vigilant against the communists, they automatically get applause. So in Guantanamo Bay, I think is here where America is keeping those people captures in the War on Terror. Back to the notes here. So peaceful transfer of power. In other words, I think there's a lot to be said for people, professional politicians, because if you're a professional politician, you know what it means to try to persuade people to get to vote for you. So you're probably going to know more about human nature than if you're an American general who's basically, his job is to tell people what to do, right? You don't have to politic, you have to persuade, you don't have to study people so much, or you're Donald Trump, right? So let's hear it for professional politicians. And so, and then of course, John Adams became the second president. He was the vice president, and he was defeated for re-election in his first attempt to be re-elected after his first term, and he agreed to accept his defeat by Thomas Jefferson. And so you can see it says precedent and tradition and legitimacy, and you put them all together and it becomes a norm. And so Al Gore, of course, I talked about that briefly in class, how he lost in 2000 to George W. Bush, even though he got 500,000 votes more than George W. Bush for president, and lost by 500 votes in Florida to George W. Bush, while George W. Bush's brother, Jeb Bush, was the governor of Florida at the same time. So always, Yet Al Gore accepted, this is America, just as we fight hard when the stakes are high, we close ranks and come together when the contest is done. And, but not Donald Trump. He tried to carry out a coup. And how close did he come to carrying out this coup? A lot of comparisons have been made with the Reichstag burning in early 1930s in Berlin, which Hitler used as a justification to declare a state of emergency in Germany. The Reichstag fire. The Reichstag is the parliament, and in 1933. And it was on and the claim was that communist agitators, including a Bulgarian, played a role in burning the parliament. And on that basis, Hitler began issuing emergency decrees to make Germany basically into his dictatorship. And so you see going on now in the United States coverage of what happened on January 6, 2001 committee hearings are now underway. The first committee hearings happened yesterday on May. Well, when was it? There you see the congressional committee that's investigating these events. A House committee had their first televised proceedings on late last week, and this. I just wanted to see if it's been uploaded here, because people do a good job of uploading Wikipedia, and I'm looking to see if it has coverage of the committee meeting that was the committee public hearings that were held just I think Friday, and I'm looking for. So yes, on June 9th, in a televised congressional hearing on June 9th, Congressperson Benny Thompson, he's chairing the committee, the House committee, and Liz Cheney, the daughter of Dick Cheney, who was vice president under George W. Bush. She's a congresswoman, a Republican from Wyoming. They have been carrying out this investigation, and they had their first televised congressional hearing on June 9th. So today is what, June 13th. And so we've been reminded, of course, it's a televised hearing, so they hired a former president of ABC. Remember we talked about media in the class. We talked about legacy media, the 3 television networks, CBS, NBC, and ABC. They hired a retired chief executive of ABC to organize the television presentation of these hearings. So it was really well done in terms of being attractive and interesting to watch. And I remember just, again, going over this morning, and what was basically really significant, I don't think gets enough credit, despite these 150 policemen who were injured as they were attacked by these protesters, attacking them on the Capitol, breaking into the US Congress, ransacking rioters inside the Senate. You can see them inside the Senate in 2001, January 6th, sitting around, taking things, doing whatever they were doing. None of these policemen pulled out their pistol and went boom, 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 even as they're being beaten ahead, even though they're being clubbed. 150 were wounded. A few died from strokes, from heart attacks as a result. None of them, except one guard did kill one protester as she broke in, Ashley Babbitt, broke into an area where the congressmen were hiding. And he decided to shoot on her and fire, and he killed her. But outside, where all these protesters were massing, and they're attacking the policemen, the policemen are fighting with their fists and hand-to-hand combat, and there's blood, they're puking up, and they're so exhausted. Nobody said, "You motherfucker." Nobody did that. And if somebody had done that, if bullets had been fired outside, who knows what? The military would have responded. The military would have come to the Capitol building, occupied the area. More bullets would have been fired. Donald Trump could have declared martial law, which is what he wanted to do. Maybe, and that's really, I think, significant, that not one of these cops who's getting beat up, punched, hurt. They didn't, not one of them pulled out a gun and went outside. And what if one had? How would history be different? And of course, that's the comparison with the Reichstag burning, right? That if there had been people shooting guns and a battle, who knows what would have happened in terms of the military being called out, Donald Trump declaring a state of military emergency, and somehow being able to carry out his plans to maintain power despite losing the election. So that's what the context for this peaceful transfer of power PowerPoint presentation, a PDF file, I should say, was produced for us to show our students about the importance of norms, even unofficial, unwritten norms. After Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Harry Truman, the Republicans came back into power under Dwight Eisenhower, and a constitutional amendment was passed that said that a president could only be elected twice in succession. A person could only be elected twice. But that was done in the 1950s, when Eisenhower was president. And let's go back then to the, what other notes do I have? Okay, so here are the notes that I have for the chapter, and we should go through them, right? Because okay, so let me see. Again, I've got to make sure I'm always sharing the screen because I might not be sharing the screen. So of course, and Donald Trump denies, of course, that the election was fair. He's still saying it was stolen, even though his own daughter has said that she accepts that Joe Biden won the election. Is Donald Trump going to run for president again? Will he win the Republican nomination if he runs again? That's all, of course, the important subtext of these committee hearings, trying to make sure that, in part, that this person can never be the nominee for the Republicans for president again. And so these notes start off with that President Trump politicized the act of voting itself. Again, this is the claim of Trump that with this great increase in voting by mail due to the pandemic, that this is the source of fraud, or supposedly the way by which the stealing of the election from him occurred. It became a topic of deep partisan division. Again, 40% of Republicans, people who self-identify Republicans, deny that Joe Biden won fairly, that believe that Donald Trump won the election was stolen from him. Democratic and Democratic-leaning voters largely drove the shift towards mail voting after Trump spent months spreading lies and misinformation regarding the reliability of mail voting. I always vote by mail, of course. Trump frightened his base away from voting by mail, so Trump's own words may have helped defeat Republican candidates in the 2020 election. Trump lost the election. Trump then launched an unprecedented campaign to subvert the results of the election. His campaign filed dozens of flawed and failed lawsuits. So that was, again, repeated in those June 9th, 2022 committee hearings that, Trump and his lawyers filed hundreds of lawsuits, and all but one or two were thrown out as ridiculous. He aimed to claiming, of course, that there was fraud. There was no evidence. He aimed instead to get the state legislatures involved. His effort was basically to somehow get the state legislatures, the Ohio Assembly, well, not Ohio, because Ohio voted 8% in favor of Trump, but Pennsylvania, Michigan, Georgia, Arizona, to have those state legislatures declare that they could not guarantee that those results were free and fair, and that the state legislatures, according to the U.S. Constitution, they claim could themselves certify the electors that would then choose the president in the Electoral College. Remember your final exam papers about the Electoral College, that the state legislature of Georgia could choose the electors that would then vote as the Electoral College for president. The effort failed, so then Trump pressured Republican members of the U.S. Congress to challenge certain slates of presidential electors from states that had voted for Joe Biden. And the January 6, 2021 congressional meeting has been until that time just a ceremony. Like the Electoral College votes in December who won the results, who's elected president. And they're constrained by state law as to who they have to vote to be president. So the winner of the Ohio election gets all of the electoral votes from Ohio, according to the law of Ohio, the state of Ohio. And and then the Electoral College meets in December, mid-December, and they vote. And then on January 6th, the Congress goes through the ritual chaired by the vice president as the presiding officer to go through the ritual of announcing the Electoral College votes. And they tried to pressure Vice President Mike Pence, the Trump campaign, the Trump lawyers, and the administration tried to pressure Mike Pence to refuse to accept the Electoral College selection from certain states, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Georgia, and he wouldn't do it. Mike Pence refused to do what Trump wanted him to do. And when that became clear, Trump then encouraged this crowd of people to go attack the Capitol. And, they were chanting, "Hang Mike Pence, hang Mike Pence." And they put up a gallows, to hang somebody for Mike Pence if they found him. And they were going through the Congress looking for these people. And as I said, one woman did die. I've never checked. What do they have here for Ashley Babbitt? She was a veteran who the killing of Ashley Babbitt. Yes. So there you can see the noose for Mike Pence that was set up, and the rioters reaching the Capitol, and she got close to the congressman, and a policeman who was a guard who was guarding the congressman decided that he had to fire on her. She was breaking through a window to get to the congressperson. She breached the speaker's lobby, shooting, and an investigation. But she's become a martyr, Ashley Babbitt, a martyr for the far right. Sort of like the people that were killed in the beer hall putsch in Bavaria were killed by the police. They became martyrs for the Nazis. Ashley Babbitt is now becoming a martyr, for political martyr for the far right in the United States. Who fired the gun? The point was made that the person who fired the gun, the officer, was black and she was white. The racism becomes involved in this. And so, anyway, she was a believer in this QAnon conspiracy, that there's this conspiracy of Democrats running a worldwide pedophilia child sex trafficking ring, not only sex trafficking, but eating them, getting the secretions from children's glands to drink and consume for superpowers. I mean, weird shit. And so in spring of 2020, as more states expanded eligibility for mail voting and began sending out mail ballot application forms to voters, Trump attacked the intentions of some of these states which rescheduled their primaries because of the pandemic. And so Trump, again, remember, the first impeachment for Donald Trump happened because Donald Trump as president tried to pressure the Ukrainian government, the new president Zelensky in Ukraine, to announce an investigation into corruption by Joe Biden's son, Hunter Biden. Because Donald Trump knew that Joe Biden was his real adversary, not Kamala Harris, not Bernie Sanders, not Pete Buttigieg, not Amy Klobuchar. It's Joe Biden. So in spring 2020, Trump began attacking the intentions of some of these states who rescheduled their primaries to deal with the pandemic. Trump then went into setting out complete misinformation, aiming to undermine the perceived integrity of the election months before it began. A primary Trump claim was that expanding voting by mail would be equated with high levels of voter fraud and ballot manipulations. Of course, the point was made repeatedly that in cases of voter fraud in the modern era are astronomically small, historically in the U.S. I mean, like 1 in millions of votes turned out to be fraudulent. He claimed that expanding voting by mail would mean that you'd never have a Republican elected in this country again. Of course, the claim is implied that if this voting is easy, then more marginalized people, brown people, black people, young people will vote. But Trump's claims became absurd because he claimed, for example, that foreign countries would flood the U.S. mail system with forged mail ballots, that juvenile delinquents in California would steal ballots out of mailboxes, that ballot drop boxes were vectors for COVID-19. This sounds crazy, but like, how crazy was the Nazi belief that the Jews were, ruling the world that led to the Holocaust? I mean, this is, again, political scientists are zoologists who study Homo sapiens, and they act like animals when we talk about nationalism. We are chimpanzees with big forebrains. And we can imagine, I love China, I love America, I love France, I love Korea, I hate the Japanese, I hate black people. And act on that broad, big forebrain thought, abstraction, with the emotions that we have as primates. And so Trump's wild attacks on absentee and mail voting reversed Republican policies over decades in various states to expand voting access and means to get out the vote. It's typically old people that really like voting by mail. Old people who retired, who have arthritis, who can't drive, they like to vote by mail. And they tend to vote Republican. So it's often Republican states that have voting by mail, like the state of Utah, very conservative, very Mormon, Republican, Christian, Republican state. They have, everybody can vote by mail in Utah. Republican leaders in these states concluded that expanding absentee and mail voting was particularly favorable for the elderly and retired voters. And these, of course, are particularly important in Florida, where in Arizona, nice, warm, Sunbelt states where people go who retire. So there's a lot of old people there in those states. And this is a state that they tend towards Republican voting. Also, campaign organizers also seek to organize their campaign efforts by getting out the getting the voters out in as early as possible, right? Like I said, 45% of Americans, they're going to vote Democratic. For those people that vote, 45% will vote Democrats, 45% will vote Republicans, and there's 10% that are independent that really are the focus of these political campaigns. But even those 45% that are going to vote Democratic or vote Republican, their votes don't count unless you get them to vote, which means you got to make them commit themselves, persuade them to go through the trivial or not so trivial allocation of time and effort to go through the process of voting. So for me, what do I have to do? I want to vote here in Korea. It means I have to get on a computer. I got to go to the website of the Stark County Board of Elections in Ohio. I got to download their PDF file for a absentee ballot application. I have to send the ballot application to the office on the second floor of this building. Say, can you please print out this attachment? They print out the attachment. Then I have to take my and then I got to put it in an envelope. And then I got to talk to somebody. How do I mail this back to you? So that's still, for many people, they won't do that unless they're pestered, unless they're pleaded, unless they're asked, please, please vote. So getting people out to vote who are your friends to vote, that takes time and effort. And if you know that they can vote weeks ahead before the day of the election, that makes it easier for you to organize your campaign. So campaign organizers also like to get this early voting through absentee and mail balloting, because they can get that task of getting their supporters to vote more likely to be completed instead of focusing all on one day. You've got to vote on the first Tuesday in the first week of November. Trump's rhetoric conflicted with his own political campaign as well as with the Republican National Committee and other state and local Republican Party organizations that in 2020 continued to send out mail ballot application forms and reminders to vote early. So previous Republican efforts to restrict voting access was to pass voter ID laws. So that had previously been the effort to not stop people from voting, but making it more challenging. So for example, when I write out my absentee ballot application, I've got to give them my social security number. I got to write it down, but you don't know what it is. The number that I have from when I retired. retire, that is the government's record of who I am in my working life, the time I started working, the time I retire. That's my social security number. Or I can give you my Ohio driver's license. I gotta write that on the document. You can say, well, that sounds great, but a lot of poor people, marginalized people, people that have criminal convictions, they don't have a driver's license. They don't own a car. They're too poor. So if you say, well, you got to show a driver's license, or you have to show a passport. I've got a passport. How many people have a passport in the US? Maybe not even half the population have a passport. How many people know their social security number? But that had been the primary effort by which the Republicans tried to limit voting, not by saying you're black, you can't vote, by saying, but we have to fight voter fraud because somebody will finally eventually figure out how to insert fake votes if we don't really make sure that you are who you claim you are and that you're allowed to vote in this district. So show me your ID, show me your driver's license, show me your passport. You don't even have a driver's license? You must be some kind of really irresponsible person. And, we don't want dumb, irresponsible people voting in our elections anyway. I mean, voting should be for people that take it seriously, right? If you can't even hold a job, if you're a convicted felon, you were in jail for something bad, should you really be allowed to vote? You can't give us any kind of ID who you are. What kind of person are you? Should we give you the right to choose who will be president when a person is so ignorant and dumb and uneducated and poor and messed up in the head? That's the subtext. And again, this is the point to highlight here in terms of what I've been trying to work through in terms of trying to conceptualize what's going on here. I know white people die from gun violence. I know that white people benefit from early voting. We all know this, but there is this image stereotype. Remember, stereotypes are gross oversimplifications. In America, that go back to the founding of the America 400 years ago, with slavery at its basis, and that if you're poor, God doesn't like you. And who are the poorest people? Black people, enslaved people. They deserve to be enslaved. They are evil. They come from a heathen place in Africa that doesn't know who Jesus is. They're barbarians, and they benefit from being enslaved. And that's why I think at root why Americans view poor people with contempt, because somehow the poorest people were the enslaved people, the black people. Like, if you're poor, you're not just poor, you're disgusting. And that's been institutionalized over the generations. So Americans tend to assume, yeah, but most gun violence, who's shooting who? It's black people shooting other black people. So who cares? And so what's the response? Black Lives Matter. We're going to make you care. That shooting in Uvalde, Texas. Mexicans killing other Mexican Americans. Mexican American cops didn't do their job. You're going to take away my right to have a gun, a weapon, as a free American because these brown people can't run their own affairs? This racist heart at the founding of America, that's not based upon facts. It's based upon stereotypes that are institutionalized in what it means to be the best American versus a bad American. And how do I know this? I mean, maybe the most well-known human rights organization in the United States. One of the most well-known is the Southern Poverty Law Center. The Southern Poverty Law Center, the SPLC. And this fights racism and anti-racist, and promotes anti-racist measures to block voting restrictions. And it recognizes in its name, the Southern Poverty Law Center, that American political culture and American institutionalized attitudes institutionalize these stereotypes on the basis of these stereotypes that poverty and the most poor equates with minorities. That we don't like poor people because the poorest people were the enslaved people. And so this hope is by fighting racism, blocking efforts to restrict voting access, that we will overcome racism once there is more social justice, because Americans equate poverty with being non-white. And so that's, I think that was highlighted in some of the reports I showed you earlier. Like, why are the Americans so resistant to gun control legislation? Because they tend to assume wrongly that these problems are problems among non-white people. So Black Lives Matter, Southern Poverty Law Center are trying to attack those institutionalized stereotypes in American, what we call political culture. So, you know, you mean you don't have a driver's license? Well, what's your problem? In 2020, Republicans responded to Trump's mobilization of his base by filing lawsuits against third-party ballot collection. So, and there have people been gone. One person has gone to prison for third-party ballot. Republicans call this ballot harvesting. That I can try to get you as a poor person, maybe old, you can't walk because you're very old, you know, to bring your ballot in your apartment. I have to fill it out. I have to fill it out, and I take the ballots. And I'm probably not an activist, but you go to the Democrats and take the ballots, and I take them to the voting office. That's been made illegal in places like Florida. That's not right. That would be fraud. But it's been quite common in the U.S. And this is all this effort since Trump to restrict voting access. So Trump's efforts were highly traumatic for American democracy. They threatened to jeopardize the integrity of future elections. In 2016, 80% of Republicans responded in polls that they were confident that votes were counted as intended, compared with 69% of Democrats. Remember, in 2000, when Al Gore lost to George W. Bush, it was the Democrats who fought to recount ballots in heavily Democratic counties. They filed lawsuits. And so did the Republicans. They wanted absentee ballots and early mail voting votes to be counted because lots of military people vote by absentee ballot. People living outside the U.S., including soldiers, and they tend to vote Republican. So you can see that this is a complex topic in terms of who benefits from early voting. You can't say that just Democrats vote from early voting. So in 2020, 93% of Democrats expressed this confidence, but only 23% of Republicans did, down from 80% in 2016. And that's the influence of Trump. Of course, the states did a decent job in organizing the election. There was chaos in some primary elections in the spring, but in responding to COVID-19, among the least appreciated of all public servants are state and local election administrators who are overworked and underpaid. Typically, they're volunteers. A lot of them are. When electoral dysfunction happens, they make story headlines. But carrying out this vast process of elections, when it works, it doesn't get headlines because we just take it for granted. But when the mistakes happen, that's when the media pounces. Television news crews cover long lines of voters waiting to vote, facing obstacles. I don't know personally if I could stand in a long line for hours to vote, but there are people that do face this challenge in the US. And when you restrict, for example, voting access, you make fewer places for voting available in inner cities, in big cities like Atlanta, where Black people are concentrated. You make it more difficult for people to vote. And they're not going to stand in line for 1, 2, 3, 4 hours to vote, a lot of them. So that's the kind of battle over voting access that we have. The vast majority of election administrators who effectively organize problem-free elections rarely receive any public credit for their efforts. And the crises of 2020 greatly compounded the challenges they faced. So as part of the COVID Response Act, signed into law in March 2020 in response to the pandemic, Congress allocated $400 million in election assistance to states and counties. But that's far short of what they needed. They needed, according to this, again, a non-governmental organization, a left-wing center, the Brennan Center, estimated they needed $4 billion to orchestrate safely the elections under pandemic conditions. And many of the states used this money for the primary elections, which meant that there was not much money left over for the November general election. Wisconsin witnessed a chaotic election when the Republican Party-controlled state legislature rejected the Democratic governor's attempt to postpone the primary election from April 7 to June, as happened in Ohio under Republican Governor DeWine, who's still there. Milwaukee, the biggest city in Wisconsin, normally had 180 polling stations, but was only able to staff 5 on April 7th. So Milwaukee is where black people will be concentrated. Black people, poor people, Hispanic people, they tend to be concentrated in big cities. So if you can make voting more difficult in big cities, you'll probably get fewer Democratic voters voting, because black people and Hispanic people vote overwhelmingly Democratic. So you can see Wisconsin, that was controlled by a Republican Party legislature, controlled by the controlling the state legislature in Wisconsin, they act in such a way that only 5 voting areas were open. Voting stations were open in Milwaukee on April 7th, when normally they had 180. Pennsylvania struggled for the first time ever to hold an election that had both no excuse mail voting. In other words, typically in a lot of places, if you wanted an early ballot to vote by mail early before election day, you had to give a reason. You say, well, like for me, I got a telephone. No problem, right? But if you're going to do that in the US, often in some states you have to give a reason. You can say, I'm sick, I can't drive. So Pennsylvania struggled for the first time to ever hold an election that had both had no excuse voting. You didn't have to give an excuse as to why you wanted an early ballot, early voting ballot. Also to allow in-person absentee voting. In other words, to be able to go to the voting station, the polling station, early before the election, days before the election, and vote days before the election. And this required Pennsylvania to pass a law to do this. Again, this is all relevant today because the person that won the Republican Party nomination to be the governor of Pennsylvania is that Doug Mastriano I showed you before. And in Pennsylvania, the governor of Pennsylvania appoints the Secretary of State. I think it's Doug Mastriano. Yeah. He has been chosen to be the Republican candidate for governor in Pennsylvania, one of the swing states, right, that gave the election to Biden, that gave the election to Trump in 2016. He's the Republican candidate for governor. He was chosen. He is all about stop the steal. He claims that the election was stolen from Trump. He was involved in the January 6th insurrection. He helped organize the protest that went down there. And he won the Republican nomination to be the candidate for governor in November. And the governor of Pennsylvania appoints the Secretary of State of Pennsylvania. The Secretary of State has oversight of the election responsibilities. They're not directly elected. That person in Pennsylvania is not elected by the voters of Pennsylvania. That person is elected in Ohio and most other states except in Pennsylvania. So this person, if he becomes governor, would be responsible for appointing the Secretary of State of Pennsylvania. And if we have a repeat of 2024 in what we had in 2020 with Biden and Trump. So the point is this conspiracy has been made, this effort to try to subvert the democratic outcome of the election, it's still ongoing now. And Yeah, he's been subpoenaed by that committee led by Benny Thompson, and he said he's cooperating as of 10 days ago, that he is cooperating with the select committee in the investigation. Former U.S. military veteran, that counts for a lot in American charisma. Oh, he's a veteran. He's a fighter for America. And he won. And he seems to be unwilling to talk to the media because he knows the New York Times, he thinks that they're hostile to him. So we'll see. So back to the notes. So there were nationwide protests in response to the killing of George Floyd and racial inequities and the Black Lives Matter movement. Because of this assumption that, well, some N-word got killed, some high on drugs, got killed by the cops for resisting arrest. Who cares? No, Black Lives Matter. Why was George Floyd a drug addicted felon? Why? What's all against systemic racism? But if you're a white person, typical white person, I don't want to hear this. I had nothing to do with slavery. Slavery ended 157 years ago. Stop claiming that America's racist. The problem is you're lazy if you're a black person. Your parents didn't raise you well. Your parents were bad, and so you're bad. So stop claiming that we owe you something. I know this. I know this from my family background. I can name, and they're cautious about talking to me because I'm a professor. But this hostility, I'm tired of black people complaining about being poor. If they're poor, and they point to my dad. My dad came to the United States with nothing, couldn't speak English, came to the US with nothing, no money, and look what he achieved. Couldn't even speak English. Had a high school degree, not some high degree. And these black people are claiming that systemic racism makes us poor and degraded. So the authorities postponed Georgia's primaries for presidential and congressional elections until June 9th. Georgia attempted to install and utilize its brand new Dominion Systems ballot marking. And of course, that's what these Stop the Steal Republican activists claim. They have these wild conspiracy theories that Dominion Systems company that generated these electronic voting machines, that they're controlled by Venezuela or Italy, like Italy-gate, that they were Italians working through the P2 Masonic Lodge that are somehow controlling these crazy conspiratorial views that, of course, don't appeal to you and me, but appeal to people that love Donald Trump. How could Donald Trump lose? Voters mark their choices on electronic touchscreen on a ballot marking device. The computer prints out a paper ballot that is then scanned. That workers struggled to get the system working effectively when it was first used in the primaries. The consequence was confusion delays, gave rise to hours-long wait delays. In Atlanta, in some voting locations, this was, June 9th primary. This is, of course, a place where blacks are concentrated. In some Atlanta voting locations, there was near chaos. Yet the experience with the primaries in the spring of 2020 allowed almost all the voting jurisdictions to carry through with the November general election with few problems, despite the lack of funding from the U.S. Congress. Nonprofit organizations got involved. Bill Gates got involved in his foundation to help these local jurisdictions carry out the election. Media outlets and election officials worked together in a spirit of in a joint effort. Professional sports teams also made available their large venues, their stadiums and other places which were idle because of the pandemic. Voters also contributed to the success of the election, heeding advice to decide on and carry out voting plans as early as possible. I saw that with my family, taking advantage of early voting. And I think my sister, she gathered up the ballots from my mother, who was, ill, and her husband's, and gathered up the ballots and took them to deposit the ballots in an early voting location. That's what Donald Trump attacked. That's fraud, or that's allowing fraud to happen. A record number of, this is during the pandemic, a record number of volunteers also contributed as poll workers to provide adequate staffing at polling stations. And voters reported remarkably high levels of satisfaction with their voting experience, about equal to 2016, despite the pandemic. Despite the vast amount of misinformation that was covered in the previous chapter that we didn't really cover too much in the class, Trump supporters and other agitators did not engage in violence or voter intimidation, despite all the misinformation sent out through social media and elsewhere. Media outlets and voting officials effectively explained that the winners of the elections would not be known on election night because of the need to count these mail-in and early ballots. So for the longest time, right, we'd have election on the first Tuesday of the first week of November, and you would know by 3 or 4 in the morning who won the election the next day, 3 and 4 Wednesday. But this wasn't going to happen because now people were sending in their ballots by mail. Like, for example, in Ohio. Ohio says, my ballot has to be postmarked here in Korea by the election day. So the election day, I don't know, November 6th, the Korean post office has put a stamp on it, November 6th, and then has to get to Ohio, my voting polling station, where I'm registered to vote, within 10 days after the election. So if the day of the election is November 6th, it must get to the voting station by November 16th. So you've got to wait 10 days to know the final vote tally. And this was always the case, but usually didn't make a difference. But now it would make a difference because we have such vast increase of mail voting because of the pandemic. And Trump was claiming, oh, it's during that time when these evil conspiracies to change the election outcome were happening by Dominion voting systems with Hugo Chavez, the ghost of Hugo Chavez in Venezuela and Italy, and crazy stuff. So Dominion voting systems, they've been suing, filing lawsuits against Rudy Giuliani, Sidney Powell, the attorneys that were leading this Trump disinformation campaign through the courts, claiming it is libel against them, because now everybody is abandoning Dominion systems because they're too controversial. It's the name of the company, Dominion Systems, that produce these electronic voting machinery. The greatest voter turnout was in states that mailed a ballot to every registered voter. Those states that placed restrictions on early voting or voting by mail, that, for example, requiring that a ballot be notarized, like you got to go to a notary public, or that a photocopy of a voter's ID be included, were at the bottom of the pack in terms of voter turnout. So I'm trying to remember what states required a photocopy of this. I think Texas might be one. I just had to put down my driver's license number. Voters tend to prefer voting by mail if they have voted by mail previously, with the Republicans somewhat lower on their preference than Democratic self-identifiers. So early voting puts additional demands on voting officials who should count early ballots in addition to organizing election day in-person voting. With the vast disinformation spread by Trump and his supporters regarding the 2020 election, Americans will have to decide whether to build upon the successes of 2020 or instead become more polarized over voter access. So restrictions are being placed. And the Republican claim, we have to do this to prevent voter fraud. When people say, but voter fraud is astronomically rare, they respond by saying, well, it is now, but it might not be in the future. Well, like what the Texas did. I didn't prepare to talk about this. I don't know what this has on Wikipedia. What does Wikipedia say what Texas is doing? Usually they're pretty good about and Texas is the heartland of American exceptionalism, by the way. That is the strongest place for the American creed. Yeah. So here's a Wikipedia site. Republican efforts to restrict voting following the 2020 presidential election. So what's this in Texas here? It says here, number of bills restricting ballot access as of March 24 last year, 2021. Texas has 26 bills in the state legislature. Brennan, Center for Justice, mentioned earlier. Georgia, 20 to 25, another swing state. Arizona, another swing state. None in Ohio because they went for Trump both times. Even though the Republicans dominate the Ohio legislature, Trump won in 2000 and 2020 by 2016 and 2020 by 8 percentage points. So things are fine there. Pennsylvania, here. And so this past election, Texas had its primary votes, and there were problems because they put these new requirements that people that had traditionally voted by mail didn't realize were in place, and so they didn't complete the ballot correctly, and they didn't fill out the envelope that contains the ballot correctly, and they didn't do this, that, and the other thing, and they sent in the ballot, and it wasn't counted, and like thousands of votes were not valid in the primary elections. Okay, so the cost of U.S. presidential elections. The 2020 presidential congressional election was the most expensive in U.S. history, totaling $14 billion spent on it. That's more than double what was spent in 2016. The Biden-Harris campaign was the first to raise over $1 billion in election cycle at $1.1 billion. The Trump-Pence campaign raised more than $700 million, more than double what they raised in 2016. Super political action committees, super PACs, political action committees, also significantly increased their spending as did congressional candidate funding. So you read about this in the reading, right? A PAC, a super PAC, according to U.S. election law, as determined by the U.S. Supreme Court, is an organization that can take unlimited campaign donations. They cannot coordinate formally their activity as a super PAC with a political campaign of any candidate for office. But they can advertise by campaign advertising time for their issues that clearly indicate who you should support in the election. Even though they're not officially coordinating with the campaign of a politician. Even though they are working for particular politicians, not formally coordinating their campaign efforts with the presidential campaign of an official candidate for office. So $6.6 billion was spent in relation to the presidential race, and $7.2 billion was spent for congressional races. And more than $1 billion of that $14 billion was spent on advertising social media platforms, Google and Facebook. And so there were efforts to limit money spent on political campaigning after the Watergate scandal in the 1970s. And I guess the claim is, I mean, this is a problematic issue, right? What's wrong with lots and lots and lots of political campaigning? Why shouldn't we allow unlimited spending on campaigns? What's wrong with that? And it's a good question. Why would we put limitations on spending on political campaigns anyway? It implies that somehow that you can persuade voters to vote for you just by propaganda. Just by propaganda. And the more money you have, the more propaganda you can generate. And if you generate more propaganda, regardless of whether or not your ideas are good, more propaganda means you win. In other words, voters are not the highly attentive, informed, proactive researchers of political campaigns and issues that we like to imagine in a romantic image that we have of citizen democracy. No, voters, if they vote, they're really influenced by the simplistic, emotional propaganda they see on TV or on Facebook, Joe Biden bad, Joe Biden bad, Donald Trump bad, Donald Trump good. Ah, I read 20 times today, Donald Trump good, Donald Trump good, Donald Trump good. And so this is sort of an unpleasant topic. And the Supreme Court ruled several years ago that we will let Exxon, Google, Facebook, Shell, Sanofi in Switzerland, Siemens in Germany spend unlimited amounts of money on American political campaigns through super PACs. Now, Siemens and Sanofi won't do it because their adversaries of those super PACs say, they're letting outside foreigners try to influence the election. And that's a nationalist response. So foreign observers interested in American elections will try to channel money through indirect means, through various forms, like individuals, giving money to individuals who then give the money to American super PACs, officially or unofficially. But just to go back to the notes here, it came into force in 1976 election and applied both to primary and general elections. There was an effort to restrict private funding of campaigns. So like when I pay my income taxes, I still have to fill out a US income tax form. I have to, I don't have it, that's on my laptop. But when I have the option of checking a little box to devote $3 to the election campaign fund for president. And all that money is added up. And then a presidential campaign candidate, they have to decide if they're going to accept this money from the US government for their political campaign. In return for accepting that money, they have to refuse or limit how much money they receive from private donors, other donors. And Barack Obama was one of the first to refuse to accept that US federal government campaign money because he would get a lot more money from private donors, unrestricted private donations. So he refused to accept that presidential donation campaign money from the US government. So by the 2012 presidential election, both the Republican and Democratic nominees, Romney and Obama, had rejected accepting these public funds with their spending limits because they were able to raise so much more money and they could do so without having to accept any limitations on the campaign spending. So in total, the Biden campaign in 2020 spent about $13 for every vote it received, and the Trump campaign received $10 for every vote it received. The billionaire, Tom Steyer, he ran for president as Democrat in the primary, spent $340 million of his own money on his campaign, and of course he lost. Former New York State Mayor Michael Bloomberg spent over $1 billion on his campaign, which lasted less than 4 months. Bloomberg won only 55 delegates, while a total of, I think like he won American Samoa or Guam, and that's about it. While a total of 1,991 delegates was needed to win the Democratic nomination for president, Biden won a total of 2,687 delegates. Now, I want to clarify here. Bloomberg got involved early when it looked like Biden was going to lose. And he was apparently terrified that, my God, Trump is going to win again and get reelected. So maybe he had a superhero complex. He decided he had to run for president, this former mayor of New York City, because he was terrified that Trump was going to be reelected. And he was thinking about running for president in 2016 when Hillary Clinton ran. And he was persuaded not to run, with the assumption or the understanding that Hillary Clinton would run and win and beat Donald Trump. And then, of course, we know what happened. So Bloomberg jumped in when it looked like there wasn't going to be really anybody who had the name recognition and the appeal that was going to be able to beat Trump. So congressional fundraising also broke records and included so-called rage donating to unsuccessful campaigns. Again, so this role of social media in generating outrage, 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 you know, to keep people's attention included big increases in money spent or donated to political campaigns to candidates who are not going to win, but people were so outraged by what they were seeing on social media that was more or less misinformation. Encourage them to give $20 or $50 or $100 to some political campaign just out of a principle. So spending in 2020 congressional elections totaled $7.2 billion, up from only $4 billion in 2016. Democrats raised $1.2 billion and Republicans raised $691 million. At the Senate level, the candidate that spent the most money won only 72% of the races. So for example, this person, a black Democrat, Jamie Harrison, challenged Lindsey Graham, the Republican senator from South Carolina, a big Trump ally. He spent almost $130 million in the South Carolina Senate election, while Lindsey Graham spent $97.6 million. And the media was saying, maybe Jamie Harrison could do this, that Lindsey Graham is vulnerable, yet Graham still won by 10 percentage points. He is now, I think, the chair of the Democratic National Committee, this person. No, this one. So yeah. Yeah, he's chairman of the Democratic National Committee. Partly because he was so successful in raising money, even though he couldn't beat Lindsey Graham. Pro-Trump acolyte. These long shot candidates with little likelihood of winning, raising surprisingly large amounts of money funding, campaign funding, reflected the so-called rage donating. Again, this polarization of American society. A significant amount of the donations to Senate candidates came from donors who lived outside the candidates' respective states. So that's an important point, right? That elections, that's a theme throughout the book, that elections have become more and more national in focus. That, yeah, they're still focused on South Carolina issues or Texas issues, but they're becoming more and more national issue focused, all of these elections. In total, Democratic Senate candidates raised 80% of their funds from out-of-state donors, which had been only 57% in 2016. And of course, that's been the case, for example, in Great Britain for many, many decades. That as democratic elections emerged in the United Kingdom from the late feudal, early modern period to the House of Commons, that now elections in all of the different constituencies in England and Scotland and Wales, they're all local elections, but they're determined by national election issues, national election preferences. And America is moving more and more in that direction. In correlation with increasing polarization of American politics, you know, and the fact that, you know, the chair of the Democratic National Committee is a black person, again, you know, I know from my family background, they're just going to assume the Democratic Party is the party of the non-white people. It's the party of the feminists, the gay rights activists, the blacks, the Hispanics, and the Republican Party is the party for white interests. They're not going to come out and officially say that, but that's the subtext of all of this. And it was the value of white people that made America great. The values of American exceptionalism, the American creed that the white people brought when they settled North America, not the indigenous values, not the values of Africa, the values of the American settlers, the white people. Very unpleasant, unspoken, but emotionally felt sentiments. The top 10 fundraising Senate candidates raised over $1 billion for the 2020 election cycle. Georgia had 4 Senate candidates in runoff elections in 2020 into 2021, January, and raised 447 million people. A winning Democrat, Joe Ossoff, raised 140 million, which was more than 133 million raised by Al Gore for his entire 2000 national presidential run. So again, spending by outside groups likewise shattered records. Groups outside of formal campaign organizations have proliferated to raise funds and spend them to influence election outcomes since the passage of the McCain-Feingold campaign finance law in 2022, so 20 years ago. U.S. court decisions have allowed for unlimited independent expenditures on influencing elections by outside organizations. That means organizations outside of the official campaign organization of Trump for president or Biden for president. These are outside organizations. They're not formally part of the political campaign. But they can spend unlimited amounts of money, such as super PACs and 501c organizations, and they have a growing impact on federal elections. So what about the McCain-Feingold law? Senator McCain and Feingold, a senator from, I believe, Wisconsin, he was defeated as Wisconsin become more red, and he died. So the McCain-Feingold law, which came into effect in 2004, forbid the Democratic National Committee and Republican National Committee. So he was a Republican and he was a Democrat. It forbid the Democratic and Republican National Committee or any other national party committees from raising and spending money beyond individual donations with legal limits on their size, organizational donations also with caps on them, and donations from federal registered political action committees. So that's all cool, but it was a US Supreme Court decision in 2015 that made unlimited expenditure by outside organizations feasible in Citizens United versus Holder? Oh, Citizens United versus FEC. Yeah, this is Citizens United versus SEC. This was a decision in 2010 by the Supreme Court in a 5-4 decision that said corporations, businesses can spend unlimited amounts of money through those outside organizations. So that's only 12 years ago. So this money that the McCain-Feingold law restricted is so-called hard money, money that is formally within political campaign organizations that officially registered, legally recognized as political campaign organizations to receive donations from donors. So put limits on how much money I can give. I think it's like $1,000. I can't give more than $1,000 to Trump for president or Biden for president organization, whatever it's called, and so on. Soft money is money given outside of those formal campaign organizations. Soft money are funds raised by outside groups that do not have an official affiliation with national party committees and political campaigns. No limits now exist in the amount of these donations, which are of course used to influence election outcomes, but these outside groups may not officially coordinate their activities with any party candidate or political organizations, but they find a way to informally coordinate. Sometimes it's even blatant, like a political candidate running for office, they got to have a website. They will put on their website an area on the website, a little box about how to portray the particular candidate campaign issues that they're promoting. And these soft money organizations look at that box and say, okay, we have to organize our efforts around those talking points that are on the candidate's campaign website. It's just, that's what's going on. Prior to the McCain-Feingold law, the national political parties were legally permitted to accept unlimited corporate, labor union, and individual donations to support election participation. They could also use these funds to engage in issue advertisements, advocating particular policy positions while criticizing promoting candidates for political office on this basis. They could not, however, openly express advocacy for the election or defeat any of the candidates. In Citizens United versus Federal Election Commission In 2010, the Supreme Court struck down long-standing legal prohibitions on corporate entities spending money in relation to federal elections. So these corporations that have billions and billions of dollars can spend an unlimited amount of money through this decision of the US Supreme Court. And what's one of the justifications for this court decision? Because they would say they find a way to spend the money anyway. They do it through indirect means, giving money through very circuitous routes, through different individuals and organizations. Let's just make it transparent. Let's just make it open. These super PACs, they have to state, these super PACs, they have to state who gave them their money. So if I see, and I go to the website and I see, oh, this super PAC got all this money from Exxon Mobil oil company. Oh, that's why they want Donald Trump to get elected, because Donald Trump's promised the oil company big benefits if he becomes, the oil industry big benefits if he gets reelected. The 501c organizations are more problematic because they are supposed to not emphasize their political campaign activity. They're supposed to be social welfare organizations with political campaigning not their primary focus of their activity. But enforcing that is difficult. And they do not have to tell you where they got their money from, who donated the money. ExxonMobil or the trade unions or Bill Gates, they don't have to tell you. It's called dark money. Hard money, soft money, dark money. And again, this goes back, we were talking in the previous class about perception of motivation, right? If I know who is funding the pro-Trump election effort, it's going to influence my interpretation of what Donald Trump is arguing or advocating when he appeals to me for my vote, right? Interpretation of motivation is critical in interpreting action by a target that I'm perceiving. And so if I know who's funding their political campaign, it's going to affect how I interpret what they're saying or acting or how they're behaving as a political candidate for office, right? But if I hide the source of the money through a 501c organization, then I'm more likely to agree, say, with an argument about how fossil fuel production is good for peace in the world by boosting America's independence from petro-dictators like Vladimir Putin. Oh, yes. But then I find out that ExxonMobil is funding that money. I'm saying, well, ExxonMobil, they probably just want more money for themselves, and they don't really care about peace in the world. They just care about their profits. And Donald Trump is being supported by them. Ah! So that's why the transparency in campaign funding is necessary. And I think that's the argument behind the Supreme Court. These huge corporations with their billions of dollars, their army of lawyers, their army of attorneys, they can always find a way somehow to get the money to somebody that they want to get the money to help them get elected, right? Through, under the table donations, this, give you money, you're not seeing me, take the money. I'm not donating money. No, let's make it transparent. Let's just make it open. Has it ever not been the case that rich people have more influence than poor people? Oh my gosh, that's so surprising. Oh, wow. Well, let's just make it transparent so we can all see it. And the US economy and the US society in general is so complex and diverse. Even as you have ExxonMobil advocating for more oil and gas drilling and usage, you have solar power companies, wind power companies who are arguing against it. And you have environmentalist groups. I mean, there are so many interests, so many diverse interests, and so many conflicting, competing interest groups in political campaigns that it all balances out. That's what democracy is all about. Do not be afraid of too much information. Has information not ever been unbiased? It's always biased anyway. Don't be afraid of democracy. Like we talked about in the previous debate, right, with Micah. Dlaczego Khan boisze wolności? Why is Khan afraid of freedom? In the media debate we had last class, right? What's wrong with infinite amounts of information? It's all biased. Even if I do not intend to be biased. Am I not biased? A political scientist? I try not to be biased. I am afraid of Trump because I'm afraid of fascism. I'm biased. I'm biased. I mean, that's the argument. That, and maybe, you know, since most Americans don't pay close attention to politics at all, the more they are overwhelmed with information, the better, because at least it's so hard to avoid getting appeals and being impacted by political campaigns because so much money is involved. That's a good thing. The more money, the better. In Speech Now versus the Federal Election Commission, yeah, that $3 on my tax return form, it goes to the FEC, right? So in Speech Now versus FEC, a federal appeals court invalidated financial limits on contributions from individuals to political committees that fund only independent expenditures or for or against federal candidates. So, so they are so-called super PACs. So independent means that these political committees are not formally part of a candidate's political campaign organization. So as long as these organizations are not formally part of a political campaign organization, they can receive unlimited amount of money. And the justification is that corporations can engage in free speech just like individuals can. Corporations have a right to free speech. And that means they can spend unlimited amount of money. And if I, as an individual, want to spend an unlimited amount of money, I can. If I'm a billionaire, like Michael Bloomberg or Tim Steyer, I can spend an unlimited amount of money. So you can see there's a Wikipedia entry on super PACs. And political action committees. And this thing is getting strange again. I'm afraid to mess with it too much because maybe this is a good point to shut down the computer and switch to my laptop. So I'm going to switch now.